Okay, folks, thanks everybody for coming. It's great to have a good crowd here. This is our this is the Yale Center for Modern Law and Policy's final speaker of the year. So this is our grand finale. Thanks everybody for being here, and especially to those of you, a lot of people came to all of our speakers, so it's really great to have this kind of commitment from folks. And we will have other great speakers next semester, but I promise you none of them will surpass Sarah Krakoff, who is our speaker today. So, so I just want to say a little bit about Sarah before I turn it over to her. Now, probably most of you remember the ruse that President Bush tried to pull on us all, convincing us that he was a Texan when in fact he's from New England. And he had the cowboy hats and the ranch, and he owned the Texas Rangers, and a lot of people, this guy is a Texan. So I don't want to disappoint everybody here, but Sarah is actually pulling a similarly elaborate ruse on the world.
Where is this going?
So I'm surprised you don't know. You're acting like it's not intentional. Yeah. So Sarah, she got her JD at Bolt Hall, so about as far west as you can go, and she's now at the University of Colorado, and she teaches or researches in public land law, in natural resource law, in Native American law, and actually authored one of the leading texts on Indian law, and she serves on the board of a couple of the Grand Canyon Trust and another. Let's see, I actually have this written down here. The Grand Canyon Trust and the Western Resource Advocates. So you can be forgiven for thinking that Sarah is a born Westerner with all of these Western issues. In fact, she is from Englewood, New Jersey, which I learned today. And it gets worse. She's also a Yale graduate, so she has two things at least in common with the president. But unlike the president, if I can say this, she has at least one mark of distinction while she was at Yale, which is that she was the captain of the cross-country team, and is actually a very distinguished runner. So she's got something sort of marking her presence here beyond just becoming president eventually. But alas, she did leave, and she went west, and she has now taken on this guise of a Westerner. But I assure you, she is truly an expert. It's not just a ruse, and I think you will probably glean some of that from the talk that she's going to give now. So, without any further introduction, Sarah Krakoff.
Thank you, Josh. That is the most entertaining introduction I've ever received, and I do have a term for myself, and we did not plan this. But I am what we call in my region a transvestite. And I'm not the only one. There's a bunch of us. So I want to thank Doug Kaiser, who couldn't be here, but he has a very good reason for not being able to be here, for inviting me. And I want to thank Josh and Suzanne for being such excellent hosts. They really helped a lot with my visit and have been a pleasure to be with while I'm here. And also, the students I've met so far, was really great to talk to you and to run with some of you this afternoon. And I've just had a great time. I hope it's not going to end now. But I was here as an undergrad, so I've also been excessively indulging in nostalgia, wandering around the campus and looking at all the cute little undergrads and thinking about... I'm wondering why they listen to the same music I did more than 25 years ago, but that's another issue. Okay, so the title for my book came about because I was struggling to come up with the right metaphor for climate change and its implications for our actions and responsibilities. I'm now somewhat disenchanted with the title, and I can explain a little bit more if you want in the Q&A why I'm disenchanted, and maybe we can have a contest and you can help me come up with a new title. But we'll set that aside. For now, the important thing is to explain the search for the metaphor rather than defend the title itself, which is parenting the planet. You're a very educated audience, so I'm going to assume a couple things. I'm going to assume I don't need to summarize the scientific conclusions about how human activity is causing global average surface temperatures to rise. That's correct. Okay, good. So this is one way in which we're all different from the former president that Josh was describing. Okay, we all know that climate change is happening, and the causes are human, et cetera. Okay, good. And I'm also going to assume that you don't need me to go into any detail about the many existing and likely effects of climate change, right? Including melting sea ice, acidification of the oceans, blah, blah. It's sort of sad that we can just like talk about these horrible effects in this way, blah, 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 all those effects. So you're all familiar with them. Good, okay. So I'm going to dispense with what I have sometimes called the climate change testimonial, which used to be part one of every law review article on the subject, because when we all started writing about this, we actually had to do convincing, not that we were in the best position to do this, but it had to start with, this is real, it's happening, and now here's my sort of legal point. So I'm going to dispense with all of that, and I won't show you any pictures of polar bears on ice caps, and oh wait, except I will. There's the mandatory manipulative photo of polar bears on melting ice. I told Doug once that it's actually, you all may not know this, it's actually illegal to show a slideshow about climate change without pictures of polar bears. And like all laws, there's a ratcheting up effect. So now you have to show more than one. So here's the mandatory manipulative photo of anthropomorphically cute polar bears. And then, because I'm here, this is the Yale polar bear. He looks thoughtful and pondering his fate and big ideas. And then this is the New Jersey polar bear. He's stealing something and walking. And the law was recently amended. This is about the only big movement in climate change legislation. And now it's also mandatory to include pictures of pika. These are the small and also very cute and fluffy critters that are disappearing from my region, my new region, the Rocky Mountain West. So there's the mandatory adorable pika. There's the Yale pika, staring wistfully. There's the rude New Jersey pika, yelling or something. I don't know what he's doing. Okay. So you all understand why our planet is warming up, what that means, at least in broad outline form, for our natural systems, other species, and future generations. And I'm going to make one last assumption, which is that you also know that while climate change is the most obvious environmental challenge of global implications, it's not the only one. Global rates of species and biodiversity loss, fisheries decline, freshwater depletion, and again, it's sort of sad, we could just reel these off in a list. These are other challenges we face that have global scale causes and effects. So that's also true, right? I don't have to go over all of that. And here's one interesting and somewhat depressing slide that just summarizes all of that. This is actually from a book by Gus Speff called The Bridge at the End of the World, and he got these slides from someone else, W. Stephan et al. So that's where you can find those, and you can find them online if you want. And they're really interesting, and it's just, these are all different rates of things happening. Paper consumption, motor vehicle transport, and here is about the Industrial Revolution. You can see the climate change slides up there, atmospheric CO2 concentration, average surface temperatures, so these are just summaries of all these kinds of global environmental problems that we're facing and future generations will face. Okay, so for all these reasons, but in particular due to climate change, Nobel Prize winner Paul Crutzen and other scientists, but I think he was the first one to use the term, have labeled this the era of the Anthropocene. And I know my friend Jed Purdy was here the other day, and he was using this same term, and it's not unique to me or to him. Scientists started using it. So it's the time, it's not really a geologic era, but scientists are using this term to describe this as the time of ubiquitous human influence on the Earth's systems. Acknowledging this, that from the depths of the oceans to the height of the atmosphere, and from the smallest cellular creature to the largest charismatic megafauna, we have and we will continue to indelibly shape and infiltrate the natural world. That's the starting point for my search for a metaphor. And I decided on the parent metaphor for several reasons, some of which may not be obvious, and perhaps that reveal more about my dark nature than they do about much else. So first, being a parent is, and my own mother's here, so it's funny to say this with her here, but being a parent is inherently tragic. A parent's best possible outcome is not to know how everything turns out. If you do know the end of the story, it's inevitably an awful one because it means your child predeceased you, and that's every parent's worst nightmare. What we hope is to die before they do. So it's all up to us, and yet we can't predict or dictate the outcomes. All we can do... What? I could have just skipped that page, and maybe you would have preferred it. Okay, this aspect of being a parent, which simply mirrors the tragic aspects of life generally, everyone dies, so in fact we don't know the end of any story except our own, seemed analogous to our situations as human beings on a warming planet, in that even if we do our best to mitigate climate change, which is a very big if at this point, the primary beneficiaries will be other species and future generations. We will not know the end of the story, and not only that, we will have reined in our tendencies toward pointless hedonism for them more than for us. So like parents, in other words, we will set aside childish things for the sake of others, even though the very best outcome for us will be not to know how it all turns out. In addition, the effort to raise another human being is an unrelenting lesson in the paradox of control. On one hand, you completely dominate your children. The utter vulnerability and dependence of one's own child is one of the most moving and frightening things about the enterprise. At the same time, this creature remains stubbornly her own person, with her own mind, her own consciousness, and her own agency. Like parents, in the Anthropocene, we as a species are in the driver's seat. At this point, choices to manage nature, to let nature be, to continue to emit greenhouse gases, to move to a zero-carbon economy, all are actions that perpetuate our influence and control one way or the other. The act-no-act distinction is at its least defensible in this context, given that we have created the blueprint according to which all subsequent choices will be carried out. At the same time, so very many things remain completely beyond our control. We have and will continue to influence the fate of the planet, but to quote the famous sage and philosopher Willy Wonka, there's no earthly way of knowing which direction we are going. That's the Gene Wilder version of Willy Wonka. So it's all up to us, and yet we can't predict or dictate the outcomes. All we can do is make choices that reflect our values, enact them the best we can, hope for the best, and then move along. So another thing I liked about the metaphor was that it was situated in the larger framework of developmental stages. Developmental psychology describes the different states of human psychological development in terms of their essential conflicts and corresponding essential virtues. The essential conflicts children face are very different from those faced by adolescents, parents, the middle-aged, and the elderly. Each stage requires its own tools in order to face life's challenges successfully, or even more basically, simply to know what the heck is going on. And it seemed to me that the early discussions about climate change and other global environmental problems were making lots of category mistakes about how to think about it and what to do, because they had not faced up to the stage we are in. So just one quick example is, I think early on, and we've moved way past this, but there was just the hope that we could, pass a few laws and make a few technological changes, and we'd be able to fix climate change, just like putting scrubbers on power plants fixed, to a large extent, certain kinds of sulfur dioxide and other emissions, right? And there just isn't that kind of easy legal and technological fix to something that every single one of our actions every day is implicated in, right? So it seems like we just needed to deal with that in order to figure out what the best path would be. So it's good to know where you are, and the metaphor of developmental stages and the choice of the parent stage was a way to call attention directly to where we are at, what that means about the virtues we might try to cultivate, and the implications for our choices one way or the other. Okay, with that framing, what the rest of the book does, so that explains the title, right? It was this search to try to just zero in on where are we? How does the Anthropocene affect the choices we make, how we see ourselves in relation to the non-human world? And that maybe if we just make those first few steps, it will be sort of liberating, and we can be a little more creative than we've been so far in terms of figuring out what to do. We won't be stuck with I think were sort of a bunch of false dichotomies pre-Anthropocene. Okay, so the rest of the book moves in the following way. Part one briefly sets the stage by describing, in layperson's terms, the scientific and social forces that have brought us to this era, so the parts I've mainly skipped over with you, and the dominant ways of understanding it that both assist and restrict us in terms of how to respond. And then the next part consists of place-based examinations of how this relationship is already being worked out on the ground in a variety of settings. So how are we managing our relationship with the non-human world in the Anthropocene? We are already doing it in a range of ways. And I know a few of you read a couple of chapters, one of which was from that part of the book. And for example, for those of you who didn't, One chapter examines one of our iconic natural places, the Grand Canyon National Park, and describes how intensely managed both the human and non-human populations are and have always been, and yet how the place, its creatures, its mysteries, secrets, and dangers remain in many important respects utterly beyond our control. These chapters also describe how choices about managing nature inevitably also reflect dominant values in other spheres of social and political life, including the rights of other human communities, ideas about the highest and best uses of property, and visions or lack thereof of freedom and equality. So not only are we not apart from nature in the Anthropocene, and arguably have never been apart from nature, but our ideas about how to carry out the human-nature relationship are never separate from our ideas about how to order society generally. So that's the second part of the book, and the Grand Canyon is just one of the places and communities that I sort of examine in detail. The third part sets out a few ideas about how to manage our relationship with the non-human world in ways that may match the central conflicts of the Anthropocene. So it's sort of more forward-looking. And it sounds, that sounds sort of cheery and normative. And I suppose it is, and it's a bit of a reaction formation to my otherwise tragic view of things. So what I'm going to read to you next is a short excerpt from this last part of the book. It's also the least well-developed, and so I apologize for that, but really do welcome your thoughts and reactions when I'm done. And so the chapter, the part that I'm going to read to you is from a chapter that is called, for now, so all titles are always up in the air, but for now the title is called Off the Grid and On the Path. Off the Grid and On the Path. We don't know many things about climate change and its effects, but one thing we know for certain is that things will be on the move. Plants will be found in new places, species will relocate on their own or with our assistance, glaciers will recede, coastlines will shift. If we're lucky, most of these moves will happen slowly. If we're not lucky, many will be sudden and dramatic. Things will break and sink, and we'll never see them again, like that ice sheet in Antarctica. Slow or fast, though, things will be moving. This will not be an entirely new state of affairs. Things are always moving. Water melts off of snowpack in the mountains and travels through canyons and valleys to the sea. Butterflies migrate from Mexico to points north and back, or at least they do for now. Salmon make their incredible journey from high alpine clear waters, streams, to the depths of salty oceans and back. Movement in this way is not even new for human communities, and there are ancient as well as contemporary examples. What are Phoenix and Florida snowbirds other than people who migrate according to the weather, living in places seasonally so their bodies don't have to work so hard to fight the temperature? What are immigrants from south of the border or across the ocean if not seekers of better material conditions to support themselves and their families? Given the predominance of movement in the world, it's strange that most of our natural resources and environmental laws create, reinforce, or at least must work within static boundaries. Rectangles were the basis of our system of land surveys, and even the lumpier shapes of American private property have hard and fast lines around them, demarcating ownership and use. Counties, states, and of course countries have even firmer dividing lines. In recent years, voices from within geography and environmental studies departments, as well as nonprofit groups, have argued for eco-regionalism to replace the given cartographic state of affairs. And in some marginal ways, the law has responded. The Endangered Species Act requires protection of endangered and threatened species wherever they are. And so its regulations reach across public and private lands, creating a de facto, if hotly contested, bioregional approach. Conservation easements and similar legal tools also slightly undermine the static boundaries approach. While the exterior borders remained intact in a conservation easement scenario, they do allow for a layered ownership of ecological and cultural functions of property. And one might even suggest that the National Environmental Policy Act nudges us toward a broader eco-regional understanding of land use because it requires assessments of the environmental impacts of major federal action, regardless of property ownership or land status. Environmental assessments and environmental impact statements often examine an entire watershed, the migratory patterns of a species, and other ecological paths, regardless of who owns the land or where the geopolitical boundaries lie. But despite these gradual erosions of the geometric approach, grids, enclosures, and boundaries remain the dominant paradigm. But what if we thought about knowing and managing the earth and its creatures in a different way, according to how humans actually move across it, or used to before cars and planes? What if paths and tracks, rather than bounded acres, defined our relationships and responsibilities to the land? What if a river's flow, rather than its quantities of water or coincidental location within a state, dictated our obligations to it? It's this concept, moving from the grid to the path, so I hope some of you at least thought it was the energy grid, which it's not, that I want to explore here. First, I'll describe a few paradigms for this way of thinking, and then I'll spend just a little bit of time discussing how we might adjust our legal and bureaucratic machinery to make these sorts of approaches possible, or at least more possible. Aboriginal Australian cultures and religions center on what Westerners have translated as the dreaming. The dreaming is a time during which the ancestors of all living creatures journeyed across the land and all of its features, leaving behind their paths known as dreaming tracks, or sometimes also known as songlines. As the dreaming ancestors created features in the landscape, so that's the path there, that dreaming track there. Along these routes, they connected landscapes, people, and supernatural beings across time and space. As they traveled, the dreaming ancestors taught human beings all there is to be known, and in that respect, the dreaming is the law. And in Aboriginal culture, they refer to it as the law. The dreaming is not understood as a distinct period of time, but rather as a dynamic reality that is constantly being revealed through collective expressions, such as ritual performances and in daily personal experience, including dreams. And while the dreaming encompasses all of the many different aspects of the creation period and its aftermath, dreaming tracks are one of the main expressions of the dreaming. So dreaming tracks are how Aboriginal people know the land, and also how they define their relationships with other human communities. As one writer put it, the dreaming tracks are boundaries, but not in the Anglo or European sense, and here I'm quoting this other author. Dreaming travels are celebrated in song, dance, story, and ritual. To say that there are boundaries is to say that there are differences. The universe is not uniform. Unlike European maps on which boundaries are lines that divide, dreaming tracks connect the points on the landscape, showing relationships between points. These are the boundaries that unite. The fact that a dreaming demarcates differences along the line is important to creating variation, but ultimately a track, by its very existence, demarcates a coming together. Dreaming tracks then are paths through a geography that tell what we might think of as a creation story located in specific places along the tracks. Aboriginal people know the landscapes through these tracks and can sing the stories and law of the land as they travel across it and encounter its features. So this is something very real. I mean, this is part of Aboriginal traditional ecological knowledge. And I've never been to Australia, but if you read descriptions of people traveling, and there are a lot of them, including perhaps most famously a book by Bruce Chatwin actually called Songlines. There is, you could be walking along with someone along their dreaming track, and they can recite to you, the significance and meaning of every single feature along that path. So they know the landscape through these tracks, can sing the stories as they travel, and encounter its features, including watering holes, rock art, cliffs, mountains, valleys, and other natural as well as cultural artifacts. On one hand, dreaming tracks or songlines seem like a very different way of relating to the land than what's typical in our law and culture. We think of and in many ways have a relationship to land in terms of large exterior boundaries of places. So we say things like, I love to visit and hike in Yosemite, right? Or Canyonlands is my favorite national park. And when we're conducting surveys to determine whether lands qualify as wilderness or wilderness study areas, we look at tracts of 5,000 acres and decide if there are too many human disturbances within a tract, and then we have to exclude it, right? So we're used to thinking and even talking about land in these chunks, acreage, not paths. But I think if we think about how we actually personally relate to places that we travel through at human as opposed to vehicular speed, we probably engage with them according to a path or a track. When we walk across cities, we experience them physically and visually as paths, not as grids are blocks. When we hike or backpack, we know, see, and experience what we can from where our footsteps are. We don't actually experience the Tetons. We may describe it that way, and our photographs may make it seem as if we've related to the entire space, but we've actually had a much more intimate relationship with what our boots could cover, what our eyes could see, what we could touch, the water we could pump, the animals we surprised or that fled from us before we could see them. So I think at some level, the idea of dreaming tracks or songlines is very intuitive. It's about knowing and relating to the land and places around us that we can actually perceive. And when I first started reading about this, I started to think about my own songlines. I run a fair amount, as you've already heard. And there are loops from my house that I think, and I don't mean to be glib about it, but in some sense are my dreaming tracks. I know every twist and turn, every boulder, every prairie dog town, the places where the red-winged blackbirds will swoop down on me in springtime when they're nesting, the place where the homeless people gather when the weather's warm to laugh and joke and share stories, right? And I bet you if you start thinking this way, you'll think about your own dreaming tracks. Dreaming tracks have their analog in many American Indian cultures. Like our Aboriginal peoples, many American Indian tribes have religions and cultures and spiritualities that are grounded in relationships with particular places. The land and its resources are integral to their worldview, and their obligations to the land are carried out in daily, seasonal, and annual ceremonies. It's often been difficult to translate these relationships into Anglo-American property or natural resources law. Songlines and their equivalent in American Indian cultures are read instead as attempts to assert broad and exclusive property ownership over vast swaths of public lands. This misunderstanding is most obvious in legal battles over sacred sites on public lands, in which the courts have often fretted that the tribes are attempting to assert the equivalent of an exclusive religious covenant. While many tribes would probably not object if their attempts to protect their sacred sites and ceremonial places resulted in the return of all of their Aboriginal lands, what they are typically seeking in these kinds of cases, the sacred sites disputes, is something much more intimate and modest. It's a recognition that they have deep knowledge of and responsibility to particular places, and that religion requires them to honor and take care of these places, whether they are set aside or not, in vast tracts. So I think if you think of at least some of the native sacred sites cases as claims to a more dreaming tracts kind of idea, then the fact that they continually lose in court is all the more poignant, because I think it's just this clash of understandings of what their relationship with the land actually is, that within it contains its own limiting principles. So to provide just one example that's a sort of a more positive example, not a losing litigation battle, there's currently an attempt by the Nuwuvi or Southern Paiute people, and they include members of the Kaibab Paiute tribes as well as the Chemehuevi tribes, to protect their Salt Songs Trail, which is a creation story very much like a dreaming track or songline. As Chemehuevi leader Gertrude Levis relates, the Salt Songs issue from a cave on the Bill Williams River, where two sisters camped and learned the songs. The sisters then traveled down the Bill Williams to the Colorado River, where they parted ways. One sister went to the northern Paiutes, and the other went south, near the Old Woman Mountains, this is all in California now, then to 29 Palms, and then south to present-day Blythe, California. Protecting the salt songs has proven to be a multimedia and multi-jurisdictional task, linking together lands that are in an array of ownerships, and that therefore require many different types of legal arrangements, from management plans on public portions of the land to cultural and conservation easements on the private portions. And I want to add just one more example and then circle back to why this conception might be helpful for a world that's on the move due to climate change. This one is in the context of water as opposed to land. In the American West, the dominant approach to water rights is prior appropriation. And under this system, the first person to divert water from its streambed and put it to beneficial use has the priority legal right to it. Prior appropriation was adopted in the early days of non-indigenous Western settlement, when secure rights to a scarce and seasonal resource were deemed necessary to further the dominant economic activities of mining and agriculture. Water was diverted to where the land was, and land, of course, was doled out according to the rectangular survey system. So we're taking water out of streambeds and watersheds entirely and taking it to irrigate land that's elsewhere, and then you own the water. So that's the system of land and water that we've inherited. And while it expedited the extractive and agricultural economies of the region, it has caused no end of contemporary legal and policy problems for a reason I can go into later if anyone's interested. But there are counterexamples of how to think about water and its relationship to land that have managed to survive within this system. Before New Mexico or Colorado were territories, let alone states, Spanish settlers moved into the area and irrigated and farmed under governance structures known as acequias. This is a ditch or a acequia that's flowing from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains there in Colorado. In the acequia system, spring runoff from the mountains is channeled to a central ditch, and parcientes, or individual family irrigators, each get a share of water from that ditch. The mayordomo presides over the acequia and makes sure that each irrigator receives a proportionate share of that year's water. Instead of first come, first served, which is prior appropriation, water is apportioned according to need in order to ensure sustainable agriculture. While there is diversion to the central ditch, the system as a whole is more path-like than grid-like. The irrigated lands are contiguous to the ditch, more like a riparian system, which is your system of water law in the east. And as a result, there are a lot of ecological benefits that flow from keeping water in the stream and having it divert, and also surprising ecological benefits from their system of flooding, which is of irrigation, which is flood irrigation. There are also social and cultural benefits, including that each parciente has an obligation to his fellow irrigators to keep the central ditch clean and to use only so much water as she needs. So this is some of the cultural and social. So there's an annual ditch cleaning. Everyone has to participate and do a lot of chit-chatting while they're doing the ditch cleaning. That was the last picture. The acequia system persists in New Mexico and Colorado, but faces distinctive risks in these times of recurring drought and intensifying competition for water. Its alleged inefficiencies, including flood irrigation, are being challenged as a cost that's too great when urban centers and large-scale farms want to purchase every unused drop of water. But like dreaming tracks, acequias may have something to teach us about laws and policies that will work for us and the non-human world now that everything will be on the move. Acequias, like songlines, are as much about defining what we know about our ecological surroundings and how we interact together as human communities in managing them as they are about conserving or preserving the non-human world itself. They establish cultural and political institutions that govern how we relate to each other and to the ecological components of our communities, and they do this at the same time. This does not mean, of course, that these institutions operate perfectly, nor that they instantiate perfect and romanticized green utopias. They are human communities and institutions, so there are all kinds of problems and flaws and bickering and fighting and so forth in acequias. And I definitely do not mean to imply that Native communities or Aboriginal communities are in perfect harmony with nature all the time. And yet, this is truly their religious worldview, right? Ecological knowledge and an ecological worldview is built into their religion, even if, like the rest of us, they don't live up to it perfectly all the time. So both of these kinds of examples start from and allow for a world in which plants, creatures, and humans are not static. Even if, as in the acequia communities, they live in one place, they're not doing the same things all year. Water and weather move, and so agriculture moves with it. Ecological knowledge is the primary and most valuable commodity, and if we applied that same idea across the landscape, we could manage it in a way that allowed us to have a relationship with the many species, and in some cases, even inanimate entities that will be on the move in the Anthropocene. So what I want us to imagine is an entirely new set of maps, composed of boundaries that connect places based on where we travel and what we know about those routes, and overlaid by other boundaries based on watersheds and riparian areas and knowledge of how aquifers recharge, just for one example. Once we have those maps, we can conceive of what our obligations to those places, their features, and their creatures might be. Composing the maps will incorporate ancient knowledge like that held by indigenous peoples and others, like farmers, ranchers, backpackers, and it can be a big tent in terms of who has the knowledge, but also entirely modern knowledge from remote sensing systems, contemporary hydrology, et cetera, right? All the technology we have at our disposal to tell us where things actually are and how they're moving, including carbon dioxide, right, among other things. Constructing these legal relationships does not have to be entirely old or entirely new either. The law of dreaming tracts can be pieced together with the new sticks in the property rights bundle that had been formulated in the era of conservation easements and tradable development rights and so forth. Asaikia's democratic and quasi-riparian governance structure can be married with John Wesley Powell's prescient ideas about watershed boundaries instead of rectangular surveys. Together, perhaps they can form the basis for a contemporary Watershed Protection Act that would do much more in the era of climate change to protect what we need than traditional preservation and pollution control laws. So those of you who are students and future lobbyists, I want you to get started on drafting and passing the Watershed Protection Act. So to conclude, to construct the kinds of social and political institutions that will allow us to relate with the non-human world, even as our actions continue to alter it through climate change and otherwise, we may need to place ecology, geography, conservation biology, along with political philosophy and other ideas about our human governance structures at the center of how we fashion our systems of governance. If we do that, our institutions may reflect the full range of our values, from how we should treat one another to how we should manage the planet for each other, as well as for other species and future generations. In short, we may need to liberate ourselves from the grid in more ways than just one. So, thanks. Thoughts, questions?
I got a question.
Josh.
You encourage the students or those who want to, make laws to think about Watershed Protection Act. Well,
that was the cheery normative part, yeah.
Yeah. So what would go into a Watershed Protection Act?
Well, first, of course, you'd have the fluffy language in the preamble, and that would go something like this: that in a time of climate change, water, our most precious resource, has to be protected and safeguarded above all else, and that the way to do that is to conceive of protecting the watershed all along where the water flows, instead of thinking about it simply as a place for pollution prevention, for one, and or two, as a source of water to be drawn from it, which is then, of course, all governed by state laws. So there'd be preamble about why this is like an important thing to do in a time of climate change. Like protecting our watersheds, I think, will be one of the most crucial things. And you would add some more language about what we know about changing hydrological cycles. And so if you're committed to protecting a watershed right and not just restricted to certain boundaries, you could be paying attention to things like changing the fact that there's less snowpack, the fact that more precipitation is going to fall as rain than as snow. So you won't be stuck with just the boundaries where you are. You can follow the watershed where it goes. And you can protect it, which you will need to now, all the more so, for all the things we don't need to recite about why water matters ecologically and to us, to human communities. So then you would have to figure out how to draft a federal law that could describe a watershed accurately enough, but with enough leeway, so as it changes, you're still protecting. But I don't think that would be too tricky. I mean, come on, lawyers couldn't do this. And then you could borrow from other public land statutes in terms of how to implement the management language and describe the various obligations and duties. And then, and now we're really being utopian. Of course, you'd have a lot of funding that would be provided to the agencies and all those that would cooperate them, like states and so forth, and tribes, to implement it. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the relation between Indian law and environmental law, and whether sort of advocacy strategies should combine the two. I know that in the U.S. often the mainstream environmental groups don't like to get too involved or to take a strong position on Indian issues, but maybe in Canada where environmental law is a little weaker, sometimes they're more willing to get involved with Indian law. I don't know if that's correct, or if you have any thoughts.
It's a really good question. I don't know the Canadian situation as well. I would be surprised if they found it any easier to find those alliances, but maybe they will. And I do think personally that there should be a lot more attempts to find common ground. I think one big barrier is that, and I say this as a member of mainstream environmental groups myself, and yet I don't think this is a new criticism. I think the difficulty is that when the big enviro groups seek to form alliances and diversify and all of that, they want to just do it by inviting people to join them in their causes, one, and that's not a great strategy, and I can say more about why later if people want. Two, or follow up with you. Two, when they find a cause that they think they can join in, like, oh yay, a tribe is fighting a coal-fired power plant instead of trying to cite one, which can often be the case, they think that even that alliance is all happy and magical and smooth, and often the folks on the tribal side see it as just a marriage of convenience. Like, and as soon as that one campaign is over, the big enviro group is gone, and they're stuck with all the same, very serious social and economic problems that they're always faced with. And then finally, maybe this is even the hardest problem, and then I'll get to some possible ways that there is room for lots of alliance. When big environmental groups want to stop a project, they often will stop a project that's being proposed for Indian country on Indian lands. And even if some tribal people are also opposed, they're much more aware of the difficult and delicate situation their own governments are in terms of providing jobs and economic development. And so even the tribal environmental activists will feel wary and suspicious of joining forces because when they say things like, you never oppose these developments on, say, the south rim of the Grand Canyon, where there's a huge hotel where you go and stay so you can hike in the canyon. And now that we want one on the Navajo Nation side of Marble Canyon, you're all against it. Like, why is it Indian country that's always the first no? Okay, so those are the reasons it's difficult to make alliances. I think the first step towards nonetheless finding ways to join forces is first to understand that those are real and significant. And second, to have the environmental groups do a lot of work to hire people who know people in Indian country, who live there and work there, and can work with the people in a way that builds a long-lasting, trusting relationship. And there are several recent examples of that are quite heartening. And I have to say, I think it makes the environmental groups, to their credit, have to stretch a lot to figure this out. All of a sudden, they're kind of doing social justice and poverty work. And maybe they didn't think they set out to do that as part of their mission. But I think if you want to broaden the environmental base and get Indian tribes and other groups, too, involved, that's the way to do it, and to take it to heart, not just do it in a token kind of way. I hope that was responsive. Yeah.
There was a recent New York Times article that echoed some of my limited experience in Native communities. There was this mass exodus of young Native people to cities. And in speaking with elders in the community that I was in, they were really worried about the younger generation and passing down stories and passing down language. Yeah. And so I was wondering what you thought about how these narratives and pathways rather than fragmentation are going to fare in future generations, or like the sustainability of those narratives as more people move into fragmented spaces.
Yeah, I know. I saw that too, and I thought it's sort of like the final wave of allotment and termination policies coming home to roost. In this era, voluntarily, right? There's not a lot of economic opportunities or development, and so more and more young people are leaving, and I think it's a very serious risk. And I lived on the Navajo Nation for 3 years, and there were all kinds of challenges and problems, social problems, poverty, alcoholism, the whole gamut. At the same time, I can tell you that when I lived there, the kids I represented in some cases and coached in others and so forth and got to know, even wearing, their typical like black concert t-shirts and, they looked like kids anywhere. Every weekend they're out herding sheep with grandma, and they knew their land and they knew these stories. So life was not great for them. There were all kinds of challenges, but they were getting this traditional ecological knowledge in their creation stories and their culture in a really real way. And one thing that was so reassuring is any time I went running with the girls, we would never get lost. I would have gotten lost in a heartbeat, but they always knew where they were. And so I say that to say that it seems to me a serious risk, and the grandmas who were quoted in the article are right to worry, and it's hard to know what to do about that. So here I'm saying we all have to get better at this and know more about our own landscapes, and meanwhile the communities I'm using as examples themselves are facing these sort of brain drain and relocation problems. All I can say is, boy, have those communities been resilient, and so it's been several hundred years of various policies trying to wipe them out, and they're still here, 566 tribes. So that gives me some kind of reassurance or hope. Yeah.
So I was struck when you were talking about your act, you were talking about agencies coming together and who's going to do what. And I was just wondering, it seems to me like this sort of policy approach to a watershed or so forth carries with it some implications for governance, different governance structures. Do we have, if we reach that point, do we have agencies collaborating? Do we have something more like that, or what do you think are the implications?
I think if I could just magically change our environmental and natural resources bureaucracy. So this is not going to happen. But one thing I think it's just too late, and I know every administration that comes in, someone tells them the last thing you should do is draw a new org chart. In other words, don't all of a sudden relabel and reorganize agencies. So I get that. It's never going to happen. But it would be much more functional if we had one federal natural resources protection agency or something like that instead of Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, all housed in different. One's in interior, some agriculture, fish and wildlife, right? So if we had that, then I think there could be a lot more, sort of what people have called cooperative federalism in the pollution law context, in the context of this watershed protection scenario, because you'd have one federal agency with all the expertise, and then they could partner with a whole bunch more operations on the ground, and they could recruit the local knowledge of acequias to participate. They could recruit the states and their now very highly developed natural resources divisions. They could recruit Trout Unlimited and all the NGOs that would be delighted to be involved in this kind of thing, and that I could actually see happening and working. I think that it is a pretty significant problem that our own federal agencies are so fragmented, but maybe we could figure that out too. Yeah.
So when you talk about the sort of watershed approach that we need for law and regulation, it seems like there's a dimension of that sort of sound ecologically based governance that understands and comprehends landscapes and regulates with some sort of ecological knowledge. And then the other dimension seems to be this kind of meaning-making capacity of law, the ability to sort of law and sort of the norms the law helps to produce and reflect to sort of instantiate social meanings and sort of teaching function. And I wonder if you could maybe comment on that with respect to sort of other sorts of environmental or laws outside of the environmental domain. I know that NEPA has been subject to a lot of criticism about whether it serves this purpose very well with its sort of aspirational preamble and its attempt to change the way that agencies think to sort of create this sort of environmental awareness and decision making, but maybe that's an unfulfilled promise. So I wonder if maybe you could reflect on that sort of meaning making capacity of law in relation to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, what your question makes me think about is how little of that has meaning making has gone on, I think, in the context of environmental regulation and protection since that big moment when all the environmental statutes were passed. And I think one of the reasons is that to a very large extent, and necessarily so, what they implemented were all these technological approaches, intensely bureaucratic monitoring machineries. And so it was very hard for the normal person to relate or get involved or frankly ever want to think about it again, right? And so it's like once environmental laws get passed, they become something we don't want to have to think about because they're just about fixing a technical problem. So how can we do more with them? And so would this be an opportunity to do more with them, to create meaning, and also to involve as many of us as possible in a daily way in the kinds of long-term knowledge acquisition and caretaking that I think will be very helpful. And I don't know, and maybe that's just too darn utopian. Maybe people are just too busy and they just want some technocrat or bureaucrat to clean things up and fix climate change and move on. I guess one aspect would be, I know some law professors think this, I don't think how the law is written makes all that much difference except to us and law students who we make read that language, a few times. But I think what the laws might set in motion on the ground, to the extent they could build on and perpetuate and recruit local involvement, local ecological knowledge, local enthusiasm for taking care of your watershed where you live, then I think we could be in business. Yeah?
Why don't you like your metaphors much?
I think I got sick of parenting as a verb, and because of the whole discussion that's going on in the media all the time about different kinds and flavors of parenting, free-range parenting and over-parenting and helicopter parenting, and I was like, I just wish we would all talk about it less and just and so it was partly just then an association with parent as a verb, and I thought, oh boy, I want to distance myself from that. On the other hand, I haven't come up with anything better, so maybe I should get over it. And in a couple of years, the media will have moved on, and they won't. I feel like it's like a way to set women at odds with each other too. Like we're all fighting about our parenting style, and it's just like I'm not fighting with anyone. I wish they would just stop making it sound like there are all these mommy wars, and so that's why. But maybe that's not a good reason. Yeah.
I really enjoyed this conceptualization, and really kind of reminded me of Eleanor Ostrom and a lot of her work and sort of community-based and kind of having people gather around local problem solving. I guess sort of on a maybe overly pragmatic, but I guess my kind of question is, how does this kind of nest? And I guess kind of the two issues that I'm thinking of, or areas I'm thinking of, are, like, for example, there's lots of different flows and lots of different sort of migrations. So you could imagine animal pathways are very much different, or somewhat follow waterways, but how do those sort of nest and build into sort of a bigger system, but also talking about Canada, kind of transboundary, how do you kind of build this across, because obviously you can do this domestically, but how does that work across different national boundaries?
Yeah, I guess it's challenging the idea of national boundaries as being relevant or helpful, which is not very pragmatic. I do recognize that. And I like the other examples you listed. I mean, this is just my first shot at this. And frankly, I'm not sure how well they all fit together. Like, I'm not sure if the Asaki example actually fits with the dreaming tracks and paths. So all this is to be thought about much, much more. I guess I think in terms of the nesting question, there are ways to, if we just start with this as a starting point, these ideas as a starting point, and think about building on them instead of what seems to me to be the case in most of the natural resources law that I work with, which is to start with the machinery at a much higher level. Despite all, we all love local in the United States, and for different political spectrum, across the spectrum, we all love it. We love states and not the federal government, or we love local food and local this. Not a whole lot of our law actually happens that way, and when it does, it's often just roughshod over and ignored. So I left out this whole interesting and somewhat depressing history of the Osages, which is they've been around since before Colorado was a territory. And they're at risk right now because Colorado water law was constructed ignoring the state's most ancient water rights, right? So now these Osage communities are in a situation where after multiple drought years, they're getting letters from the state engineers saying, we're cutting you off. Even though they're like, why? We've had our water rights for centuries, but they never registered with the state system for a whole bunch of reasons that you might be able to imagine. They didn't trust it. You know, they didn't move to Colorado. Colorado moved to them. It's not their system. Okay, so we tend to start from some level higher up when we're doing natural resources law and management in many, many situations. So maybe the answer to the nesting question, well, honestly, it's I don't know. But if we started from local, sustainable, this is a sustainable agricultural community, whatever sustainable means. This is as close as it gets. And if we started there and built up from it, instead of the opposite way, maybe we could have institutions at a higher scale that would actually support local sustainability.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on like the future of the trajectory of Indian law scholarship. I saw that you participated a few years ago in a conference called like, the New Realism. I'm not entirely sure what new means in relation to realism there, but
it's just a way to name a conference. It's the new, yeah.
But it seems like it was kind of a call for like sort of an empirical, social scientific grounding and sort of some Indian law scholarship to create laws that maybe will have momentum, to create approaches that will have momentum within and beyond sort of Indian territory. And I'm wondering if that, where sort of that has gone and sort of what your reflections are and what maybe Indian law scholarship also needs to continue its vitality.
Okay, so that question, thanks, it's a great question, maybe obscure to some people. So obviously one of my fields is American Indian law, and you heard some of that in here, but not a lot. And it's a fantastic and perpetually interesting area of the law. It's also one that you have to be prepared for a lot of defeats in the federal courts if you're going to work in this area on behalf of tribes on the tribal side. And so the fact that in the since about the middle of the Rehnquist era, the Indian cases that have gone up to the court have had only a 20% chance of winning. And that percentage has gotten even worse in the last 15 years, means that it's caused some Indian law scholars to do some hand-wringing, like, what are we doing? Like, pretty much everything we write is about why courts in general should stay their hands when they're taking away tribal powers, right? If anyone can do that, it should be Congress, that the Supreme Court shouldn't be making up new common law rules that diminish tribal powers. You know, so we all write about this in all these really, we think, convincing ways, and the court never listened. So this is, you know, for some people caused a bit of a crisis, and there was this conference called the New Realism where we tried to talk seriously about, well, what kinds of things should we be doing? Like, just talking to the courts is not working. So what kinds of knowledge should we be producing? And so first, I think this was less like hand-wringing and so forth for scholars of my generation and younger, because we started working in the field long after the federal courts started being really bad for our cause. And so we were just used to it and never looked to them to be our saviors and defenders of treaty rights, which you could in an earlier era. And I think the stuff we were writing was, one, more critical, you know, tended to be more critical of doctrine, and two, more already in this vein of sort of a new qualitative and sometimes quantitative empiricism. Let's just tell them what's really going on in Indian country, good, bad, and indifferent. You know, we're not going to shade it, but we're going to tell these real stories so that whether judges ever listen or not, one, at least we've gotten these real stories out there about what tribes are like, how they function, how their legal systems function. And then that knowledge and information will be there. And this is one good thing about scholarship, forever, molding away in some law review article or elsewhere. And also others, policymakers, legislators can rely on it too, right? So we're not just so doctrine focused. The answer is, it's just happening. I think it's just what most of us do now. And anyone who's still, you know, writing fake amicus briefs to the court in the guise of law review articles is they're just wasting their time. That's my sense.